In the rolling hills of Henrico County, Virginia, where tobacco fields stretched like green seas beneath the summer sun of 1784, the Caldwell family maintained one of the most prosperous plantations in the Commonwealth. To neighbors and visitors, they appeared as pillars of post-revolutionary society, wealthy, refined, and deeply religious. But buried within the walls of Millhaven Estate lay a secret so disturbing that when it finally surfaced in the winter of 1789, it would shake the very foundations of Virginia's aristocratic society. Court records from the period, sealed for over 2 centuries, reveal a tale of calculated deception, forged documents, and a young woman who discovered she had been raised from childhood for a purpose so sinister it defies comprehension. 23 witnesses testified to events so shocking that 3 judges recused themselves from the case, claiming moral inability to proceed. The authorities tried to bury this story, the church denied its existence, and the surviving family members fled Virginia never to return. But the truth, as it always does, eventually found its way to light. Before we continue with the story of Elizabeth Hartwell and the Caldwell family's forbidden bond, I want you to know that this channel is dedicated to bringing you the darkest, most unsettling true stories from America's past. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our weekly deep dives into history's most chilling mysteries. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? I love hearing where our community of mystery lovers is tuning in from around the country. The documents that survived this scandal would remain locked in Richmond's courthouse basement until 1892, when a clerk cataloging old files discovered them by accident. His report to the Virginia Historical Society described the contents as too disturbing for public consumption, and they were sealed again for another 50 years. The story begins in the autumn of 1776, when Virginia was still reeling from the chaos of revolution and the promise of independence. Millhaven Estate, sprawling across nearly 3,000 acres of prime tobacco land, had been in the Caldwell family for 3 generations. The original land grant, signed by Governor Alexander Spotswood himself in 1722, had established the family as one of the colonial elite, a position they had maintained through careful marriages, shrewd business dealings, and an unwavering commitment to preserving their wealth and status. The patriarch, Jonathan Caldwell, was a man of considerable influence, a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses before the Revolution, a tobacco merchant with connections stretching from Richmond to London, and a widower whose wife Catherine had died in childbirth just months before the Declaration of Independence was signed. At 42, Jonathan possessed the kind of commanding presence that made men listen when he spoke, and women lower their eyes when he passed. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with dark hair that was just beginning to show silver at the temples, and eyes the color of winter steel, he had the bearing of a man born to authority. His late wife had been a Harrison, one of the first families of Virginia whose bloodline traced back to the earliest Jamestown settlers. Catherine Harrison Caldwell had brought both substantial dowry and unimpeachable social credentials to their union, elevating the Caldwell name to the highest echelons of colonial society. Their marriage, though brief, had been the talk of Richmond's social circles, uniting 2 of the most powerful tobacco fortunes in the Commonwealth. The war had disrupted traditional trade routes and created unprecedented opportunities for those clever enough to navigate the shifting political landscape. Jonathan had been among the first Virginia planters to recognize that the new nation would need new money, new alliances, and new ways of preserving old power. Unlike many of his fellow aristocrats who had remained loyal to the crown out of tradition, Jonathan had supported the revolution from the beginning, not out of idealistic fervor about liberty and democracy, but out of cold calculation. He understood that independence would mean new laws, new courts, and new opportunities for men with the intelligence to exploit them. His gamble had paid handsomely. When other planters struggled to find markets for their tobacco in the chaos of war, Jonathan had established connections with French merchants through contacts in Philadelphia. When currency became worthless, he had insisted on payment in gold and land deeds. When other estates fell into debt and ruin, Millhaven had prospered, expanding its holdings by purchasing adjacent properties at a fraction of their peacetime value. But prosperity brought its own challenges. Without a male heir, Jonathan faced the prospect of seeing Millhaven estate divided among distant cousins upon his death, a fate that his grandfather, the original Jonathan Caldwell, had warned against in letters that still resided in the family strongbox. The old man had been prescient about many things: the importance of land, the value of bloodline, and the absolute necessity of keeping family wealth consolidated at all costs. "A fortune divided is a fortune destroyed," he had written in his final letter to his grandson. "See that the Caldwell name and the Caldwell lands remain forever united, no matter what sacrifices this unity may require." The weight of this ancestral commandment pressed heavily on Jonathan's mind as he contemplated his future. He had considered remarrying. Indeed, several prominent Virginia families had made discreet inquiries about their unmarried daughters, but Jonathan found himself unable to stomach the thought of sharing his authority with another strong-willed woman like Catherine. He had grown accustomed to absolute control over his domain, and the prospect of once again negotiating with a wife who possessed her own family connections and opinions about estate management held no appeal. More troubling still was the question of loyalty. Any woman he married would bring her own family's interests into the union, potentially diluting his focus on preserving the Caldwell legacy. What Jonathan needed was not a partner, but an instrument. Someone completely devoted to his vision, utterly dependent on his protection, and bound to him by ties that transcended mere marriage contracts. It was against this backdrop of calculation and ancestral obligation that fate, or perhaps something more deliberately orchestrated, brought Elizabeth Hartwell into Jonathan's life. November rain drummed against the windows of Millhaven's great house, with increasing intensity as the storm that would change everything gathered strength. Jonathan sat in his walnut-paneled study, reviewing shipping manifests by the light of 3 silver candelabras, French pieces that had been Catherine's contribution to the household furnishings. The room reflected his character perfectly. Every book precisely arranged, every document filed according to his exacting system, every surface polished to mirror brightness by servants who knew their master's standards, brooked no compromise. The plantation ledgers spread before him told a story of almost unprecedented success. The tobacco harvest had exceeded all expectations. The new French contracts had proven more profitable than even his optimistic projections, and his investments in Richmond real estate were yielding returns that made him one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. Yet something gnawed at him as he worked, the persistent knowledge that all this wealth would be meaningless if he could not ensure its preservation for future generations. It was nearly midnight when Samuel Brigham, his overseer, appeared in the doorway. Brigham was a lean, weather-beaten man who had served the Caldwell family for over 20 years. First under Jonathan's father and now under Jonathan himself. His loyalty was absolute, his discretion unquestionable, and his willingness to carry out orders without asking uncomfortable questions had been tested and proven on numerous occasions. "Master Caldwell," Brigham said, his voice carrying an unusual gravity that immediately caught Jonathan's attention. "There's been an accident on the Richmond Road. A carriage overturned in the storm. Appears to be quality folk, sir." Jonathan set down his quill with deliberate care. Quality folk meant responsibility, especially for a man of his standing in the community. More importantly, they often meant opportunity. "How far from our gates?" "Perhaps 2 miles, sir, near Devil's Elbow where the road curves around the creek. The driver's dead, sir, and the gentleman and lady—" Brigham shook his head. "They were thrown clear when the carriage rolled, but they didn't survive the fall. The horses bolted, but we managed to retrieve the baggage." "Survivors?" "A child, sir. A girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years of age. She was thrown into the bushes, probably what saved her life. The girl keeps asking for her Uncle Thomas, but she's in shock, sir." doesn't seem to recall much else about what happened. Jonathan's mind immediately began calculating possibilities. Orphaned children of quality families often presented interesting opportunities for a man with the resources and connections to exploit them properly. What of identification? Papers, letters, anything that might tell us who they were? Brigham's expression grew carefully neutral, an expression Jonathan recognized as indicating information his overseer preferred not to discuss in detail. Found some documents in the gentleman's coat, sir. Name appears to be William Hartwell, traveling with his wife Margaret and their daughter. They were carrying a considerable sum in gold, sir. Payment for land they were apparently planning to purchase in the Kentucky territories. The mention of gold sparked Jonathan's immediate interest, but it was Brigham's tone that caught his full attention. There was something the overseer wasn't saying directly, something that required a more private conversation. Bring the child here immediately, Jonathan instructed. See that she's cleaned, fed, and given dry clothing. And Samuel, he paused, meeting his overseer's eyes with a look that conveyed volumes without words. We'll discuss the other details of this unfortunate accident in private once the child is settled. What Jonathan saw when he entered the guest bedroom an hour later would remain etched in his memory forever. The child sat on the edge of the four-poster bed that had once belonged to his grandmother, still wearing a nightgown that Martha, the head house servant, had found for her. Despite her ordeal, there was something unmistakably refined about her bearing. The way she held her hands folded in her lap, the careful pronunciation of her words when she thanked Martha for the warm milk, the quality of her abandoned dress that now hung drying by the fire. But it was her face that truly captured Jonathan's attention. The child bore a striking resemblance to his late wife Catherine, particularly around the eyes and the delicate set of her jaw. Her hair, once it had been washed and dried, proved to be the same rich chestnut brown that Catherine's had been. And when she looked up at him with those large dark eyes, Jonathan felt a shock of recognition that made his breath catch in his throat. "What is your name, child?" Jonathan asked, his voice unusually gentle as he took a seat in the room's single chair, positioning himself at her eye level. "Elizabeth Hartwell," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the refined accent of educated society. "My parents, are they truly gone? Samuel said there was an accident, but I thought perhaps—" The question hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Jonathan studied the girl's face more carefully, noting not just her resemblance to Catherine, but also the intelligence that sparkled in her eyes despite her obvious distress. This was no common orphan, no simple farm child who could be easily dismissed or quickly forgotten. This was a child of obvious good breeding, well-educated and articulate, who would be missed and sought after if she simply disappeared. But she was also completely alone, frightened, and utterly dependent on his charity for survival. "I'm afraid so, my dear," Jonathan said softly, reaching out to pat her hand in what appeared to be a gesture of paternal comfort. "But you're safe now. Tomorrow, we'll make inquiries about this Uncle Thomas you mentioned. We'll find your family and see that you're properly cared for." Even as he spoke these comforting words, Jonathan's mind was already working through possibilities that would have horrified a less calculating man. Here was a child of obvious quality, orphaned and alone, with family connections that were apparently distant and difficult to verify. The possibilities were not just intriguing, they were extraordinary. "Thank you, sir," Elizabeth said, her natural politeness shining through despite her exhaustion and grief. "You're very kind to take me in. I don't know what would have happened if your man hadn't found me." Jonathan's smile was warm and reassuring, masking thoughts that were anything but paternal. "Think nothing of it, my dear. It's our Christian duty to help those in need, and I suspect you and I are going to become very well acquainted indeed." That night, as Elizabeth slept in the guest room under the watchful eye of Martha, Jonathan met with Samuel Brigham in the estate's wine cellar, a location chosen specifically for its privacy and the impossibility of their conversation being overheard. What passed between them in that dimly lit stone chamber would set in motion events of unimaginable consequence. The first inquiry letter Jonathan wrote was never sent. Instead, it joined a growing collection of documents in a locked drawer of his study. Documents that told a very different story than the one he presented to his neighbors and the local authorities. Through careful and methodical investigation, Jonathan learned that Elizabeth's parents, William and Margaret Hartwell, had indeed been traveling to meet relatives in the western counties when their fatal accident occurred. But these relatives lived in the remote mountains near the Kentucky border, in settlements so distant and isolated that communication was sporadic at best and often took months to traverse the dangerous wilderness roads. More importantly, the Hartwells had been relative newcomers to Virginia, having moved from Maryland just 5 years prior to establish a small but prosperous shipping business in Norfolk. This meant their local connections were limited, their social circle was small, and their sudden disappearance would likely be attributed to the dangerous conditions of frontier travel rather than foul play. Within a month of the accident, Jonathan had crafted a masterful deception that showcased both his intelligence and his complete lack of moral constraints. He presented himself to the county clerk as Elizabeth's appointed guardian, bearing carefully forged documents that claimed her mysterious Uncle Thomas had died of fever in the Kentucky wilderness just weeks before her parents' carriage accident. The timing was perfect, tragic enough to evoke sympathy, recent enough to explain why no one had been notified, and distant enough to make verification impossible. As her only surviving connection to Virginia society, Jonathan had graciously agreed to raise the girl as his ward, a charitable act that enhanced his reputation as a Christian gentleman while serving his own purposes perfectly. The county clerk, overwhelmed with the administrative chaos left by the war and impressed by Jonathan's standing in the community, accepted the documents without question and officially appointed him as Elizabeth's legal guardian. The transition was gradual and carefully orchestrated. Elizabeth, traumatized by her loss and isolated at the remote plantation, gradually began to accept Jonathan as her protector and benefactor. He hired Miss Adelaide Fenwick, an educated spinster from Richmond, as her tutor, ensuring that Elizabeth received an education appropriate to her station, while carefully controlling her exposure to the outside world. He ensured she was treated with kindness and respect by the household staff, provided her with beautiful clothing and books, and slowly began the process of molding her into something very specific to his needs. But Jonathan's plans required more than simple guardianship. In the winter of 1778, he made a trip to Richmond that would prove crucial to his ultimate design. There, in the elegant offices of his lawyer, Cornelius Vance, Jonathan executed a series of legal maneuvers that were breathtaking in their audacity and sophistication. Vance was a man who understood the value of discretion and the importance of asking no uncomfortable questions when dealing with clients of Jonathan's caliber. Short and precise, with thinning gray hair and the soft hands of a man who had never performed manual labor, he had built his practice on serving the complex legal needs of Virginia's plantation elite. His offices occupied the second floor of a federal-style building on Main Street, furnished with imported mahogany and lined with leather-bound legal volumes that represented decades of studying the intricacies of property law, inheritance rights, and marriage contracts. First, Jonathan had Vance draw up formal adoption papers, making Elizabeth legally his daughter and potential heir to his estate. The documents were masterpieces of legal precision, establishing not only his parental authority over her, but also her rights to inherit Millhaven estate in the absence of other direct heirs. To any casual observer, this appeared to be nothing more than the generous act of a childless widower providing security for an orphaned child. Second, and more remarkably, he had Vance prepare what appeared to be a standard marriage contract, but one with a peculiar provision that would only become significant years later. The contract was between Jonathan Caldwell of Millhaven Estate, Henrico County, and a young woman of suitable breeding and education to be determined at a future date. The language was deliberately vague, the timeline deliberately indefinite, and the specific identity of the bride deliberately omitted. Vance, well compensated for his discretion and his willingness to draft unusual documents without asking uncomfortable questions, raised no objections to the arrangement. In the complex world of Virginia property law, such open-ended marriage contracts were not entirely unprecedented. Wealthy men often arranged marriages years in advance to secure favorable business partnerships or consolidate family holdings. The adoption papers were filed with the county clerk and became part of the public record. The marriage contract was not. It remained in Vance's private files, waiting for the appropriate moment to be executed. As Elizabeth grew from child to adolescent under Jonathan's carefully controlled environment, his attention to her education became almost obsessive in its intensity and specificity. She learned French from a private tutor, Latin from the local minister, mathematics and literature from Miss Fenwick, and household management through careful observation of Martha's duties. She was trained in the social graces expected of a plantation mistress, the intricate protocols of Virginia society, and the complex business operations that kept a large estate profitable. To outside observers, Jonathan was simply ensuring his adopted daughter would make a suitable match when she came of age, perhaps to a younger son of good family who needed a wife with property, or to a rising merchant who could benefit from connection to the Caldwell name. His dedication to her education was viewed as admirable, his paternal affection as touching, and his plans for her future as appropriately responsible. But there were other lessons too. Subtle conditioning that began when Elizabeth was still too young to understand its implications. Jonathan frequently spoke of the importance of family loyalty above all else, of the sacred bonds that transcended conventional society, and of the biblical precedent for unusual family arrangements that served God's higher purposes. He told her stories of the patriarchs of old, men who had multiple wives and complex family structures that ensured the survival of their bloodlines through difficult times. He spoke often of the Caldwell family history, emphasizing the sacrifices that previous generations had made to preserve their land and legacy. He told her of ancestors who had died defending their property, of family members who had made difficult choices to ensure survival, and of the sacred obligation that each generation owed to those who came before and those who would come after. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Jonathan began to emphasize Elizabeth's special role in this continuing saga. She was not merely his adopted daughter, he explained, but the key to preserving everything the Caldwell family had built over generations. She was intelligent enough to understand business, beautiful enough to reflect credit on the family name, and loyal enough to put family interests above personal desires. By 1782, when Elizabeth was 16 and blossoming into a young woman of remarkable beauty and intelligence, the psychological foundation of Jonathan's plan was nearly complete. She had been isolated from contact with young men her own age, told repeatedly that her destiny lay in preserving the Caldwell legacy, and gradually conditioned to see Jonathan not merely as her adoptive father, but as the center of her universe and the architect of her future. The final phase of Jonathan's plan began in the spring of 1784, when he announced to Elizabeth that he had received correspondence from a distant cousin who wished to arrange a marriage that would unite two branches of the Caldwell family and ensure the estate's preservation for future generations. The proposal, he explained, represented the culmination of years of careful planning and would secure her future while honoring the obligations she owed to the family that had raised her. Elizabeth's first glimpse of her intended husband came in the form of an exquisite miniature portrait that Jonathan presented to her in his study on a warm April morning. The painting, set in an ornate gold frame and obviously the work of a skilled artist, depicted a man who bore a striking resemblance to Jonathan himself. The same strong jaw, the same piercing dark eyes, the same air of quiet authority that seemed to emanate even from the small painted image. "His name is Jonathan Caldwell," her adoptive father explained, his voice carefully neutral as he watched her examination of the portrait. "He's a cousin from the western counties, a man of good character and substantial means who has built quite a successful tobacco operation in the mountains. The marriage would unite our family holdings and ensure that Millhaven Estate remains intact for future generations." Elizabeth studied the portrait with growing confusion, noting details that seemed somehow familiar yet impossible. The man's clothing was expensive but slightly outdated, his pose formal in the manner of portraits painted a decade earlier. Most puzzling of all was the uncanny resemblance to Jonathan, so striking that they could have been brothers rather than merely cousins. "But his name is the same as yours, Papa," she said, using the affectionate term she had called him since childhood. "How can this be? I thought our family naming customs were more varied." Jonathan's explanation was both brilliant and horrifying in its calculated simplicity. The cousin, he explained, had been named for the same ancestor, a common practice in colonial families seeking to honor their forebears and maintain connections across generations. This Jonathan Caldwell had inherited land in the Shenandoah Valley and had built a successful tobacco operation there, but he lacked the social connections and cultural refinement that came with generations of established wealth and position in Richmond society. The marriage would benefit both parties, Jonathan continued with the smooth persuasiveness of a practiced manipulator. The cousin would gain access to Virginia's aristocratic society and the business connections that came with the Caldwell name, while Elizabeth would help preserve the family estate and ensure that her own future was secure. More importantly, the union would keep the family wealth consolidated rather than allowing it to be dispersed among various distant relatives who might not share their commitment to preserving the Caldwell legacy. "But I would be leaving you," Elizabeth said, and Jonathan was pleased to detect the genuine distress in her voice. Over the years, he had carefully cultivated her emotional dependence on him, ensuring that the thought of separation would be not just uncomfortable, but nearly unthinkable. "Not leaving, my dear," Jonathan replied, his voice soft with paternal affection that masked deeper, darker currents of satisfaction. "Expanding our family. This union has been arranged with great care to ensure that you will never be far from those who love you most. In fact, the arrangement includes provisions for your new husband to spend considerable time here at Mill Haven, helping to manage the combined operations of both estates." The wedding preparations began immediately, but they were unlike any Elizabeth had witnessed during her occasional visits to neighboring plantations or her rare trips to Richmond society events. Rather than the grand public ceremony typical of Virginia plantation society, with its elaborate guest lists, weeks of festivities, and celebration that might involve hundreds of family friends and business associates, this would be a private affair, conducted at Mill Haven Estate with only a small number of carefully selected witnesses. Jonathan explained this unusual arrangement as a necessity of both practical and social considerations. Many prominent families remained scattered by the recent conflict. Travel was still dangerous in many areas, and the groom's family had expressed a preference for a simple ceremony that would not interfere with the complex business negotiations that were part of the marriage settlement. Additionally, the bride's orphan status made a large celebration inappropriate. It would be more seemly to conduct the ceremony with dignity and restraint rather than the elaborate festivities that might seem insensitive given her tragic background. As summer gave way to autumn, Elizabeth found herself increasingly troubled by aspects of the arrangement that didn't seem quite right, despite her respect for Jonathan's judgment and her gratitude for his care. The wedding invitations, which she was not permitted to see personally, were allegedly sent to the groom's family and various distant Caldwell relatives, but no responses ever arrived at Mill Haven. When she asked to read the letters of acceptance or regret that should have been flooding in from invited guests, Jonathan explained that such correspondence was being handled through his lawyer in Richmond to avoid burdening her with unnecessary details. When she requested permission to correspond with her intended husband before the ceremony, a reasonable desire that would allow them to become acquainted before their wedding day, Jonathan explained that the man was currently traveling on business throughout the Western Territories and preferred to maintain the traditional formality of limited contact before marriage. Such restraint, he assured her, was actually a mark of respect and serious intent rather than indifference. Most disturbing of all were the legal documents that Cornelius Vance brought to Mill Haven in September, riding out from Richmond in a hired carriage loaded with leather portfolios and mahogany document cases. Elizabeth was asked to sign various papers related to her inheritance rights, the marriage settlement, and the complex business arrangements that would unite the two branches of the Caldwell family. But when she attempted to read them carefully, both Jonathan and Vance assured her that the legal language was far too complex for anyone without legal training to understand properly. "These are merely formalities required by Virginia law," Vance explained in his precise professional manner. "Standard documents that establish your rights as both an heir to the Caldwell estate and as a bride entering into a marriage contract that involves substantial property considerations. Your signatures are necessary to make the arrangements legally binding, but the actual terms have been negotiated by your father and myself to ensure your complete protection." One document in particular caught Elizabeth's attention, a property deed that seemed to transfer her inheritance rights as Jonathan's adopted daughter to someone else entirely. When she questioned this alarming development, Jonathan's explanation was smooth and rehearsed. Upon her marriage, her legal status would change from daughter to daughter-in-law of the Caldwell family, and the paperwork simply reflected this transition while ensuring that her ultimate inheritance rights remained intact. But Elizabeth was more intelligent than Jonathan had perhaps anticipated, despite his years of careful conditioning. The education he had provided her included enough exposure to legal concepts and property law to recognize that something about these arrangements was fundamentally wrong. The language of the documents seemed deliberately obscure. The timing of the paperwork seemed rushed, and the explanations she received seemed designed to discourage further questions rather than provide genuine understanding. Late at night, in the privacy of her bedroom, she began to piece together a puzzle that would reveal the full horror of her situation. The truth began to unravel on a cold October evening when Elizabeth made a discovery that would change everything. Unable to sleep due to a combination of wedding anxiety and nagging doubts about the arrangements Jonathan had made, she had gone to his study to retrieve a volume of poetry, assuming he would be asleep. The great house was silent, except for the settling sounds of old timber and the distant whisper of wind through the bare branches outside. Instead of the empty room she expected, she found Jonathan working by candlelight, carefully reviewing documents spread across his mahogany desk in neat, precise rows. The scene was illuminated by 3 silver candelabras, casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with leather-bound books and family portraits that seemed to watch with disapproving eyes. As she approached to announce her presence, she glimpsed something that made her blood turn to ice and her breath catch in her throat. Among the papers was the miniature portrait of her intended husband, but beside it lay a small mirror, positioned so that Jonathan could compare his reflection to the painted image. Even more disturbing, she could see that he was making small adjustments to his hair and expression, apparently practicing to match the pose in the portrait as closely as possible. Elizabeth retreated silently, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain Jonathan would hear it, despite his apparent concentration. Her mind reeled as she tried to process what she had witnessed. The resemblance between Jonathan and the man in the portrait wasn't coincidental. It was identical because they were the same person. But how could this be? What possible explanation could there be for such an elaborate deception? The answer that came to her was so monstrous she could barely admit it to herself, yet it explained everything that had troubled her about the wedding arrangements. There was no cousin. There had never been a cousin. Jonathan intended to marry her himself, using a false identity to make the arrangement appear legitimate, while maintaining the legal fiction of their father-daughter relationship. Over the following days, Elizabeth began her own investigation, using the skills of observation and analysis that Jonathan himself had taught her during years of education and training. She started with the household correspondence, carefully examining letters when opportunities arose during her lessons with Miss Fenwick or her conversations with Martha about wedding preparations. What she found chilled her to the bone and confirmed her worst suspicions. There were no letters from any cousin named Jonathan Caldwell. There were, however, communications from Cornelius Vance discussing the special arrangements and the need for absolute discretion regarding the unusual nature of the ceremony. There were also bills from a Richmond portraitist for modifications to existing miniature, and payments to various merchants for clothing and accessories that seemed designed to alter someone's appearance. The breakthrough came when Elizabeth discovered a locked drawer in Jonathan's study during one of his trips to Richmond on business. Using a hairpin and techniques she had learned from watching Martha repair household locks, she managed to open it while the house was busy with afternoon chores, and her presence in the study would not be questioned. Inside, she found documents that revealed the true scope of his deception. The original inquiry letters about her parents that had never been sent, the forged guardianship papers establishing his authority over her, the fabricated correspondence supposedly from the fictional cousin expressing eagerness for the marriage, and most damning of all, detailed notes in Jonathan's handwriting outlining his plans for their wedding night and the years that would follow. But it was the marriage contract that revealed the full horror of her situation. The document, in Vance's careful legal handwriting, was between Jonathan Caldwell of Millhaven Estate, Henrico County, and Elizabeth Hartwell, legally adopted daughter of the aforementioned Jonathan Caldwell. There was no mention of any cousin. The groom and the adoptive father were explicitly identified as the same person. The implications crashed over Elizabeth like a wave of ice water, leaving her trembling and nauseated as she sat in Jonathan's chair reading documents that outlined her fate with businesslike precision. Every kindness he had shown her, every lesson he had taught, every moment of paternal affection had been calculated steps toward this ultimate violation. She had been groomed from childhood to become not just his heir, but his wife, a woman who would be simultaneously his daughter and his bride, ensuring that his bloodline would continue while his estate remained intact under his absolute control. The most terrifying aspect of the scheme was its legal sophistication and the complete helplessness it created for her. By adopting her first, Jonathan had established her inheritance rights and his paternal authority over her. By marrying her afterward, he would maintain control over the estate, while ensuring that any children born to the union would be indisputably legitimate heirs to the Caldwell fortune. In the complex legal landscape of post-revolutionary Virginia, where property rights were paramount and family bloodlines determined social standing, the arrangement was disturbing, but not necessarily illegal. Even more horrifying were Jonathan's notes about his long-term plans. He had calculated that Elizabeth's youth and his established position would allow them to present themselves as a conventional married couple when traveling or conducting business away from Millhaven. The adoption papers would remain filed but unmentioned. The marriage certificate would show only their names without reference to their previous relationship, and their children would grow up knowing Jonathan only as their father, never learning the truth about their mother's origins. That night, Elizabeth lay awake planning her escape, but as dawn approached, she realized the horrible truth. She had nowhere to go and no resources of her own. Jonathan had been meticulous in his isolation of her from the outside world. She had no friends her own age, no connections to families who might help her, no money or property in her own name. Even if she could prove what he intended to do, the very documents that would serve as evidence had been crafted to make her appear complicit in the arrangement. The wedding was scheduled for November 15th, just 3 weeks away. Time was running out, and Jonathan's trap was nearly perfect in its cruel completeness. Elizabeth's opportunity came in the form of an unexpected visitor who arrived at Millhaven Estate like an answer to desperate prayers. On November 3rd, a traveling minister named Reverend Thomas Hartley appeared at their gates, seeking shelter for the night during his journey between parishes in the Virginia countryside. His surname made Elizabeth's heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. Could this be a connection to her true family? Reverend Hartley was a man of perhaps 50 years, with graying hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his time traveling rough roads between scattered settlements. His clothing marked him as a man of modest means, but respectable station, and his conversation during dinner revealed an extensive knowledge of Virginia families and their histories, knowledge that came from years of performing baptisms, marriages, and funeral services throughout the Commonwealth. During the evening meal served in Millhaven's formal dining room beneath portraits of Caldwell ancestors, Elizabeth listened intently as Reverend Hartley spoke of his travels throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. He told stories of frontier settlements, isolated plantations, and the challenges of ministering to communities scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness. When Jonathan stepped away to instruct Samuel Brigham about accommodations for their guest, Elizabeth seized her chance. "Reverend Hartley," she said quietly, her voice carefully controlled despite the excitement and fear coursing through her. "Might I ask if you knew a family named Hartwell? I believe they may have been distant relations of mine." The minister's weathered face brightened with recognition and genuine warmth. "Indeed I did, child. William and Margaret Hartwell. Tragic loss. That carriage accident some years back. They were good people, faithful Christians who attended my services whenever they were in Norfolk on business. They spoke often of their daughter Elizabeth, a bright girl they were taking to live with Margaret's brother in the Kentucky territories after they concluded some business dealings in the West." Elizabeth's composure nearly shattered as she heard confirmation of facts that Jonathan had claimed were impossible to verify. Her brother, not her Uncle Thomas. Brother Thomas, yes. Thomas Whitfield was his name, though Margaret had kept her maiden name of Hartwell after marriage. Not uncommon in families where the woman brings substantial property to the union. Last I heard, he was still operating a trading post near Harrodsburg, still hoping for word of his sister's family. Quite worried about them, actually, since they never arrived for their planned meeting. "Why do you ask, child?" Before Elizabeth could respond, Jonathan returned to the dining room, and the conversation shifted to other matters. But Elizabeth had learned enough to confirm her worst fears, while simultaneously discovering that she had family, real family, still alive and searching for her, and the Uncle Thomas that Jonathan claimed had died was actually Margaret's brother. He bore a different surname entirely, and he was not only alive, but actively seeking information about her parents' fate. That night, Elizabeth made a desperate decision that would require every ounce of courage and intelligence she possessed. She would confront Jonathan directly, not to seek his mercy or attempt to negotiate her freedom, but to gather the evidence she would need to expose his crimes to Reverend Hartley. If she could convince the minister to carry word of her situation to the authorities in Richmond, she might have a chance to escape the trap that had been closing around her for 13 years. She waited until the household was asleep, then crept through the darkened corridors to Jonathan's study, where she knew he often worked late into the night, reviewing business correspondence and plantation records. She found him exactly as she had expected. Reviewing the final details of their wedding ceremony, the forged documents spread before him like the plans of a military campaign. When he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, still wearing her white nightgown and wrapper, his expression shifted from surprise to something far more dangerous, a cold calculation that reminded her forcefully that she was completely alone with a man capable of murder. "Elizabeth," he said calmly, setting down his quill with deliberate precision, "you should be sleeping. Tomorrow we have many preparations to complete for our wedding ceremony." The possessive emphasis he placed on the word "our" sent a chill through her, but Elizabeth forced herself to remain steady. "There is no cousin," she said, her voice surprisingly strong despite the terror coursing through her veins. "There never was. You intend to marry me yourself." Jonathan's mask of paternal affection finally slipped completely, revealing the cold predator that had always lurked beneath the surface. The transformation was terrifying in its completeness. Gone was any pretense of fatherly love, replaced by the calculating gaze of a man whose carefully laid plans had been discovered, but who remained confident in his ability to control the situation. "You are more perceptive than I anticipated," he said, rising slowly from his chair. His imposing frame cast long shadows in the candlelight, and Elizabeth was reminded forcefully of how physically powerless she was against him. "Yes, there is no cousin. And yes, in 12 days you will become my wife. You will also remain my daughter, my heir, and the mother of the children who will carry on the Caldwell name. It is an arrangement that serves everyone's interests perfectly. Everyone's interests but mine," Elizabeth replied, surprised by her own boldness in the face of such overwhelming danger. Jonathan's smile was cold as winter moonlight, devoid of any warmth or humanity. "Your interests are my interests, Elizabeth. They have been since the night I found you, orphaned and alone on the Richmond Road. Do you think your rescue was mere chance? Do you think I chose to raise you, educate you, and provide for you out of simple Christian charity?" The implication in his words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow, confirming suspicions she had barely dared to acknowledge. "The carriage accident? You knew about it beforehand?" "I arranged it," Jonathan said with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather. "Your parents were traveling with a considerable sum of money, payment for land they intended to purchase in Kentucky. My men were instructed to waylay the carriage and retrieve the funds, but you were an unexpected bonus. When I saw you, saw how remarkably you resembled my dear Catherine, I realized Providence had provided me with something far more valuable than mere gold." The full horror of her situation crystallized in that moment with stunning clarity. Her parents hadn't died in a random accident. They had been murdered on Jonathan's orders for their money. She had been kidnapped, not rescued. Everything about her life for the past 13 years had been built on violence, deception, and the calculated grooming of a child for purposes so evil they defied comprehension. "The law will not permit this," Elizabeth said, though even as she spoke, she knew the futility of the words in a society where women had virtually no rights, independent of their male relatives. Jonathan's laugh was genuinely amused, the sound echoing off the walls lined with law books and family portraits. "The law, my dear, is whatever men like me choose to make it. You are legally my daughter, which means you are under my absolute authority until marriage. You will legally become my wife, which means you will remain under my authority thereafter. The documents are all properly executed, witnessed by respectable men, and filed with the appropriate courts. There is no law in Virginia or anywhere else that can touch us." He moved closer as he spoke, and Elizabeth could smell the brandy on his breath, could see the cold satisfaction in his eyes as he contemplated his complete victory over her will and her future. "More importantly, my dear, you have nowhere to go and no one to help you. Your precious Uncle Thomas believes you died with your parents 13 years ago. You have no friends, no money, no connections to anyone who might assist you. Even if you could somehow escape Millhaven, you would be a penniless orphan with no proof of your identity and no way to survive." But Jonathan had underestimated one crucial factor. Elizabeth's desperation had been matched by 13 years of education and careful observation. She had learned not just literature and mathematics, but the art of reading people, understanding motivations and recognizing weaknesses, and she had identified Jonathan's greatest vulnerability, his overwhelming pride in his own cleverness. "You're right," she said quietly, allowing defeat to creep into her voice. "I have no choice but to accept what you've planned. But I need to understand something before I resign myself to this fate. How did you know my parents would be traveling that road with so much money? How did you arrange such a perfect ambush?" Jonathan's expression shifted to one of satisfied pride as he recognized what he thought was her capitulation. Like many intelligent criminals, he could not resist the opportunity to explain the brilliance of his scheme to someone who could appreciate its complexity. "Your father was a fool," he said, settling back into his chair with the air of a man enjoying the chance to boast of his achievements. He advertised his business dealings far too openly, spoke too freely in Norfolk taverns about his plans to purchase land in Kentucky. It was simple enough to learn the details of his journey, the route he planned to take, and the fact that he would be carrying enough gold to complete the purchase. As Jonathan continued his explanation, detailing the months of planning that had gone into her parents' murder and her own kidnapping, Elizabeth carefully memorized every word. She had no weapon, no way to overpower him physically, but she had something potentially more powerful, a witness sleeping upstairs who carried the moral authority of the church and the legal standing to be believed by magistrates and courts. What happened next became the subject of whispered speculation throughout Henrico County for decades afterward, a story that combined elements of justice, revenge, and divine providence in ways that defied easy explanation. On the morning of November 15th, 1789, the day scheduled for the wedding ceremony that would have completed Jonathan's monstrous plan, Millhaven Estate erupted in chaos that would destroy the Caldwell family forever and expose secrets that had been buried for 13 years. Elizabeth's plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution, born from 13 years of careful education and desperate necessity. She had spent the previous 12 days not in passive resignation, but in methodical preparation that drew upon every skill Jonathan had taught her. Using her knowledge of the household routines, her access to Jonathan's study during his daily plantation inspections, and her understanding of the legal and business systems he had used to maintain his deception, she had methodically gathered evidence of his crimes. The evidence she compiled was overwhelming in its scope and damning in its specificity. She carefully copied the forged guardianship papers that established Jonathan's authority over her, the fabricated correspondence supposedly from the fictional cousin, the detailed financial records showing payments to the men who had carried out the attack on the Hartwell carriage, and most importantly, Jonathan's own notes outlining his long-term plans for their marriage and the children he expected her to bear. But Elizabeth understood that evidence alone would not be enough to bring down a man of Jonathan's wealth, connections, and social standing. She needed something more dramatic, more public, and more legally binding. She needed witnesses whose testimony could not be dismissed or suppressed, and she needed to create a situation where Jonathan's crimes would be exposed in a way that made denial impossible. The wedding ceremony was scheduled to take place in Millhaven's Great Hall, with Reverend Charles Pemberton officiating, and a carefully selected gathering of witnesses that included Cornelius Vance, several neighboring planters and their wives, local magistrates and prominent members of Richmond society. To these witnesses, the event would appear to be nothing more than the wedding of a devoted guardian to his adopted daughter. Unusual, perhaps, but not unprecedented in a society where property considerations often trumped personal preferences in marriage arrangements. Elizabeth appeared in her bridal gown, a dress of ivory silk that had belonged to Jonathan's first wife, Catherine, altered to fit her smaller frame, looking pale but composed. Her hair had been arranged in the elaborate style, fashionable among Virginia society ladies, adorned with pearls that had been Catherine's wedding jewelry. To the assembled guests, she appeared to be a beautiful and appropriately nervous bride, perhaps overwhelmed by the significance of the day, but resigned to her duty. Jonathan stood beside her wearing his finest clothing, a coat of midnight blue wool, buff-colored waistcoat, and pristine white stock that emphasized his commanding presence. His satisfaction was evident in every line of his posture as he prepared to achieve something remarkable. A marriage that would preserve his estate, continue his bloodline, and maintain his social standing while violating every moral principle of civilized society. Reverend Pemberton, an elderly minister who had served Virginia Plantation Society for over 30 years, began the ceremony with the traditional words that had united countless couples throughout the Commonwealth. His voice carried the weight of religious authority as he spoke of the sacred bonds of matrimony, the duties of husband and wife, and the divine blessing that attended the union of two souls in Christian marriage. As the ceremony progressed through its familiar rhythms, the assembled witnesses began to relax into the comfort of ancient ritual. This was, after all, simply another plantation wedding. Perhaps unusual in its circumstances, but following patterns they had witnessed countless times before. The bride was beautiful, the groom was prosperous, and the match would serve the practical purposes that governed most aristocratic marriages. Reverend Pemberton had reached the traditional question about impediments to the marriage. If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. When Elizabeth spoke in a voice that carried clearly throughout the hall, "I must confess a deception, "Before God and these witnesses," she said, her words cutting through the ceremonial atmosphere like a blade, "I am not Elizabeth Caldwell, adopted daughter of Jonathan Caldwell. I am Elizabeth Hartwell, and this man murdered my parents to steal their gold and kidnap me for the purpose you see here today." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Jonathan attempted to silence her, claiming she was suffering from bridal nerves and the hysteria that sometimes affected young women facing the responsibilities of marriage. But Elizabeth had prepared for this moment with the thoroughness of a lawyer preparing for trial. She produced the documents she had stolen from his study, handing them to Reverend Pemberton and the assembled witnesses with a calm precision that made her accusations impossible to dismiss as feminine hysteria. As the evidence was examined by men who understood legal documents and financial records, the full scope of Jonathan's crimes became undeniable. The forged adoption papers, with their careful alterations and fabricated signatures. The correspondence planning her parents' murder, written in Jonathan's own hand. The financial records showing payments to Samuel Brigham and others for special services rendered on the Richmond Road. The detailed notes outlining his grooming of Elizabeth from childhood for this ultimate violation. It was all there, documented with the meticulous precision of a man who had never imagined his crimes would be exposed. But Elizabeth had one final revelation that would ensure Jonathan could never escape justice through legal technicalities or social connections. "There is one more crime you must know about," she announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "Mr. Caldwell's first wife, Catherine, did not die in childbirth as he has claimed to this community for 13 years. I found her diary hidden in the basement of this house, along with correspondence from Dr. Marcus Fleming of Richmond describing symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning. She died by poison, administered by her husband when she discovered his affairs with slave women and threatened to expose him to Richmond society. The accusation of uxoricide, wife murder, combined with the evidence of Elizabeth's kidnapping and the murder of her parents, created a scandal that even Jonathan's wealth and connections could not suppress. Several of the witnesses were magistrates themselves, men whose legal training enabled them to recognize the validity of the evidence Elizabeth had presented. They immediately placed Jonathan under arrest, pending a formal investigation, despite his protests and attempts to claim that the entire affair was a misunderstanding orchestrated by a mentally unstable young woman. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational in Virginia's early history, attracting attention from newspapers as far away as Philadelphia and Boston. Jonathan attempted to mount a defense based on claims that Elizabeth was mentally unstable, that the documents were forgeries created by disgruntled servants, and that the entire affair was a conspiracy designed to steal his property. But the evidence was overwhelming. Elizabeth's testimony was delivered with calm intelligence and supported by physical proof, and even Jonathan's former allies in Virginia society began to distance themselves from a man whose crimes had become impossible to deny. The prosecution, led by Virginia's most prominent legal minds, painted a picture of calculated evil that shocked even hardened observers. Here was a man who had murdered 3 people for money, kidnapped a child, and spent 13 years grooming her for sexual exploitation while maintaining the facade of Christian respectability. The case became a symbol of the corrupting influence of unchecked power and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members from those who would exploit them. Jonathan was convicted on multiple charges: murder in the first degree for the deaths of William and Margaret Hartwell, kidnapping and false imprisonment for his treatment of Elizabeth, fraud for the forged documents, and murder in the first degree for the death of his wife Catherine. The sentence was death by hanging, carried out in Richmond on March 15, 1790, before a crowd that included many of the same society figures who had once competed for invitations to Millhaven Estate. Elizabeth used her inheritance, legally hers as Jonathan's adopted daughter and the sole surviving victim of his crimes, to track down her uncle Thomas Whitfield in the Kentucky territories. The journey took 3 months and required the assistance of federal marshals, but she eventually found him still operating his trading post near Harrodsburg, still hoping for word of his lost family members. Their reunion was tearful and joyful, but Elizabeth carried scars that would never fully heal. She had survived 13 years of psychological manipulation and had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. But the experience had changed her in fundamental ways. She possessed a hard-won understanding of human evil and a determination to prevent other children from suffering similar fates. She never married, despite receiving numerous proposals from men who were attracted by her beauty, her intelligence, and her substantial inheritance. The very idea of placing herself under a man's legal authority remained too frightening, too reminiscent of the trap from which she had barely escaped. Instead, she devoted her life and fortune to establishing schools for orphaned children throughout Kentucky and Virginia, creating institutions where vulnerable young people could receive education and protection without being exploited by those who claimed to care for them. The schools she founded became models for child welfare throughout the expanding nation, emphasizing not just education, but also legal protections for orphans and systems for verifying the backgrounds of those who sought to adopt or employ children. Her work influenced the development of legal safeguards that would protect countless children in the decades that followed. Elizabeth died in 1847 at the age of 81, surrounded by some of the hundreds of children whose lives she had saved and improved over the decades. Her funeral was attended by governors, senators, and prominent citizens from across the nation, all paying tribute to a woman who had transformed personal tragedy into a lifetime of service to others. Millhaven estate was sold to pay legal debts and victim compensation, but the great house stood empty for years before finally being demolished. Local residents reported that crops would not grow properly on the land where it had stood, and livestock refused to graze in the fields where Jonathan had planned his crimes. The property remained vacant for over a century, eventually becoming part of a state forest where visitors today can still find the old foundation stones, though few know the dark history they represent. The Caldwell name disappeared from Virginia society entirely. Distant relatives changed their surnames or moved to other states, unable to bear the stigma of association with Jonathan's crimes. The family's place in the social hierarchy that had seemed so secure, so permanent, vanished completely within a single generation, proof that even the most carefully constructed facades of respectability cannot ultimately withstand exposure to the truth. Samuel Brigham, Jonathan's overseer who had participated in the murders, was tried separately and hanged 6 months after his master. Cornelius Vance, the lawyer who had facilitated the legal deceptions, was disbarred and fled Virginia to avoid prosecution, though he was eventually tracked down and imprisoned for fraud and conspiracy. The case became a cautionary tale told in law schools and theological seminaries, an example of how corruption and abuse of power can flourish when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. Elizabeth's courage in exposing the truth, despite the personal risk and the overwhelming power of her oppressor, became an inspiration for reformers working to establish legal protections for women and children. This story shows us how evil can hide behind masks of respectability and social standing, how vulnerable people can be exploited by those who claim to protect them, and how courage and intelligence can ultimately triumph over even the most carefully planned crimes. Elizabeth Hartwell's determination to seek justice not only saved her own life, but prevented Jonathan Caldwell from claiming other victims and established protections that would benefit countless children in the years to come. What do you think of this story? Do you believe such elaborate deceptions and systematic abuse were possible in the legal chaos of post-revolutionary America? How do you think Elizabeth found the courage to risk everything by exposing Jonathan's crimes when she had no guarantee that anyone would believe her or help her? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about how one woman's intelligence and determination brought down a seemingly untouchable predator who had hidden his evil behind wealth and social position. If you enjoyed this dark tale from Virginia's hidden history, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear Hit the notification bell so you never miss our weekly explorations of America's most chilling historical mysteries. And share this video with someone who appreciates stories of courage triumphing over calculated evil. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters often wear the most civilized masks, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are those who refuse to remain silent in the face of unspeakable injustice.